right, should we get started? Great. Well, thanks for your patience, and we appreciate the overwhelming interest in today's webinar. My name's Joe Mujali, and I'm from the co-sponsor of this presentation, Banner Solutions. Banner is a full-service technical staffing firm located in the Boston area. We've been lucky enough to partner with Damon Poole and Nexxle to bring you today's webinar about product owners' best practices for user stories. As I mentioned earlier, there's been a great response to this webinar. We've limited the attendees to 100 seats. They've all been reserved within a couple days. So ideally, this will be the first in a series of Agile-related topics for future discussions. And as a quick reminder, we encourage participation via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll gather the questions throughout the slideshow and then address them towards the end of the presentation. And I imagine many of you are here because you know Damon Poole or are familiar with his work. Damon is a serial entrepreneur and agile thought leader. He founded AccuRev. He's built agile practices for multiple agencies like Banner Solutions and has led agile transformations in several enterprise-level organizations. Damon's latest venture is an extremely user-friendly, free priority management system called Nexxle. I'll let Damon tell you more about Nexxle, and then we'll get into today's presentation.
All right, just a brief overview of Nexxle. Nexxle allows you to keep track of your own personal to-do lists. You can collaborate with others, and you can use it for personal work, whatever you like. And the standard edition, which will work for most people, is free. All right, so on to our webinar. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We're going to be focusing on user stories and how to create good and small user stories. And that all starts, though, from the top. So the top, of course, is your product. Here's an example product. Bring your own device data backup for large businesses to protect IP. And you'll notice that there's a who here, large businesses, a what, bring your own device data backup, and a why, to protect IP. So even at the high level, we have those three things, who, what, and why. The next level down, some people call these features, some people call them components. You know, honestly, or capabilities, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what word you use. At the next level down, it's still value. It's not your traditional work breakdown structure kind of thing. It is always value. So the best way to think of this is the next piece down, while large, should be something that you could produce as its own product. Something that has value. So if we look at some of these, you can see that it doesn't say anything about infrastructure or databases or back end or front end. It's talking about each individual large piece as though it was its own product. Still looking from the perspective of value. Products and epics are too large to do within, so we're going to talk about I'm assuming that you have knowledge of Scrum and Agile already because we're focusing on user stories. So within Scrum, we would talk about a sprint, which might be from 1 to 4 weeks. 2 seems to be very popular. Epics are too large. So we need to talk about user stories. User stories, as an example, we have Android user wants to save and restore notes for simple backup. Right, so that's an overall piece of the full backup from device to data center epic, which is a piece of the bring your own device data backup product. So we're going from large value to smaller to smallest value. And the user story is something that can be implemented within the sprint. That's the basic idea there. To really sort of bring this home, sometimes people put in a framework of I've got products and I've got epics and I'm going to implement epic by epic. I would encourage you to think of epics as a framing device to to get the thought process going, to think about, you know, what is our product, to better describe it. But when it comes to implementation, forget about it. Forget about epics. Forget about products. Focus on the stories for a sprint. What's the highest value? So those stories might come from all different epics. A story from here, a story from there, and together they're going to produce something of value for the customer, something coherent. All right, so think of the products and the epics just as a framing device to get to your user stories. And a good user story is something that you can get from start to production in less than 2 weeks. Now, for some of you that are not familiar with what I'm about to say, I can assure you that there are definitely companies that do this, lots of them. And what I mean by that is start to finish in 2 weeks. I mean, there's no UI, there's no test plan, there's no architecture, there's no nothing, there's just a user story. And they do whatever user interface needs to be done, whatever test planning needs to be done, whatever testing needs to be done, whatever coding needs to be done within that iteration. So that's what I mean by start to finish. Now you might say, well, some of our stories go longer than a sprint. I would say that's probably not a user story then. So how can we get smaller user stories? Well, first, let's talk a little bit more about what a user story is. So we sort of covered it already, and I'm going to go through this very quickly because there is an assumption that you're already familiar with user stories in general. That there is a who are we doing it for, a what, which is what we've always done in the past, where the what is really straightforward, why. The reason for this is that it helps us focus on everybody being on the same page. The user can look at this and say, yep, that's something I want. A tester can look at it and say, oh, in case of accidental changes, well then, so we're not going to test having it off the device, it's going to be on the device. I get that. And then we'll talk more about the exact characteristics when we talk about invest, because it's kind of the same thing. So there are many ways to judge what's a good user story. Bill Wake's invest is the classic. I think actually the simplest way to judge whether or not you have a good user story is that if you put it into production and you show it to a user, that there's a user you can show it to and they say, oh, hey, that's something I needed, thank you. If, on the other hand, they're not really sure what it was that you produced, and they're not really sure once they figured out why they'd want it, it's probably not a user story. So, independent, and we're going to talk about each of these a little bit more as we go through. Independent means that if you had written down your user stories on 3x5 cards and you threw them up in the air and then you recollected them, you could implement them in that order. That's true independence. Now, getting true independence is hard. Generally, you want to focus on reducing dependency, and we'll talk about that. Negotiable, that's kind of a funny term. I think it was just so that he could get the word invest in there. But really what that means is that rather than saying specifically how something is going to be implemented, there's a goal, but the implementation is left open. Valuable, that's pretty straightforward. It's something that, you know, like I said, the user will look at and say, thank you. It's not a technical task. Now, very often people will say, oh, well, we have developer stories and QA stories and technical stories or whatever. If it's not something that a user can use, it's probably a task. And yes, it has value internally, but not to the user. If you write a test plan and show it to the user and say, hey, this is really valuable, they'll say, well, yes, having no bugs is valuable, but I don't actually get value until it's all together. So value to the user. Yes, there's internal value, but here we're talking about value to the user. Estimatable, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that actually. Everything else sort of feeds into that. If you have something that's valuable, negotiable, independent, small, and testable, most likely it's estimatable. But the only way to know whether or not something is estimatable is that you work with a team and say, hey, what's the estimate? If they say we're not sure, then probably it's not small enough or the outcome is not clear. You've got some more work to do. Small, we're going to be talking about why small is important all the way through here. But the general idea is that if you have something small, then it's more likely that the estimate is correct, that it's well understood, that you can get it done quickly, hopefully before the end of the iteration, and that you can get feedback on it, right? So if you can get feedback early on and the product owner or even the customer says, hey, that's the wrong color, fantastic. Or, I was expecting pie charts, not bar charts. That's great. Now you don't keep going in the wrong direction. Testable. This doesn't just mean QA. This also means that somebody can use it and say, that's what I intended, that's what I wanted, or that's not quite right. So to understand whether or not you've actually implemented what was desired. We're going to talk quickly about backlog just for a moment, just as a reminder that we're going to, within a sprint, we're going to take the things that have the highest value and work on those, whatever fits within a sprint, in business value order. So let's start with value. So here we have some examples of potential stories. And in the email follow-up that we show you, that we send you, we'll include a link to a game which has 90 mini games in it, and there's about 80 good and bad stories. And you can use this to work with your team to write better user stories, to understand these various concepts a little bit better. And I got to tell you, when I put this game together, my understanding of user stories went up a notch, and it's a lot harder to put something into a game if you're not exactly sure what you're doing. So it really sort of sharpened up my game as well. So valuable. Here we have some examples. I want you to look at these quickly and just determine which ones do you think have value, why or why not. So I'll just give you a moment to think about that. Okay, let's take a look at the results. There's two here that are valuable. So you're a shopper, you're standing in a store, and you want to locate an item, let's say flour. So you go to your app, type in flour, and it says that's aisle 3, you're in aisle 1, head to the left. Great, that's valuable. A database on its own has no value to the user. So great, there's a database of coupons from all vendors somewhere in the system, but I can't access it. So as a user, while this is necessary, it's not sufficient for me to do something. Right, so I have a coupon on hand. I want to know if it's valid at the store. Having the database is valuable from the implementation perspective, but not for me as a customer. So as a user, I want to upload images, maybe a profile or an avatar picture, or there's some other way that I want to add my own personal flair, background, banner, whatever. So the fact that I can upload it is great, but if I can't actually put it somewhere, that has no value. So not until I can use it and it does something for me does it have value. Lastly, moviegoer wants to be able to see movie reviews for a given movie. So that's great. And if I have an app that's all about movies and all it does is it does the reviews, that has value. Now maybe I'm using the review to figure out if I want to actually reserve or go see a movie, and it doesn't have reserve in the app yet. Still, you know what? If it's a free app and I can see movie reviews, that has value. So let's look next at size. Right, so really this is about small. But I think in order to get to small, we need to be able to think about what size is something. Is something large? Is it small? So I'm going to give you a moment to look at these and to determine whether you think that these are products, epics, or stories. Some will be products, some epics, some stories. So just give it a moment. Okay. So we have the results. So we have two products. Now the interesting thing is that the product on the left is very wordy. So that feels like a product. The one on the right doesn't have a lot of words, but if you think about it, traveler wants to book a hotel, they have a right there about hotels.com or tripadvisor.com or something like that. That's a whole product. Managing your movie loyalty cards, so the ability to add them, remove them, update them, maybe validate that this is a valid loyalty card and to associate a credit card with it. So it's not a whole product, because having the loyalty cards there is great, but being able to use them to help reserve a movie or to apply some credit towards a movie purchase or something like that, that's going to be more, towards the whole product. So that's an epic. Then the last one, the shopper wants to use a given coupon during purchase, right? So that's not a product, it's not an epic, it's something that likely can be implemented within the sprint. So that's a story. So that's that small story there, that's the kind of thing that you want to work towards within an iteration. If you can't do it within an iteration, it's really not a small story, and it's probably not really a story. So testable, what are some examples here? So let's look at this. Shopper wants interface to be fun so they're happy while shopping. Well, that's cool. And you might have some idea what fun means. Maybe it's playful colors, maybe it's some animation, maybe there's some way to, maybe it's gamified, you get some points or something, but that's your opinion. How do you test if it's fun? Well, so this is not really testable. Art buyer wants the app to be beautiful so they can show it off to their friends. Well, how do we quantify beauty, right? So that's hard to test. Shopper wants app to respond quickly to make quick decisions. Okay, so maybe I'm a developer on this and I know that right now the app is a bit slow. It takes 3 seconds for some things. So I'm thinking, you know what? If I can get that down by a second, I get it down to 2 seconds, that's great. But I don't know if that's what's desired, so that's really not testable. It's measurable, but it's not testable. Security admin wants threat dashboard to increase risk awareness. Well, what is the current level of awareness? What level of awareness do you want me to change it to? I can't test that either. So when you're looking at stories, you want to think, how would I know that I have accomplished the goal? Now, this may sound like acceptance criteria, and really it is. But my thought on this after doing acceptance criteria for a long time is that acceptance criteria are actually a flag, a red flag that your stories are too large. It's very likely that you've heard of the concept of splitting by acceptance criteria. Good acceptance criteria actually describe something that you can implement in the story. So for instance, if you say, I want to be able to sort. Okay, so I'll know it's done when I can sort by time, by date, by address, by review, by movie review, like a 4 or 4.5 or whatever. So each of those actually can be broken out into individual stories. So I would say acceptance criteria are a great place to start, but you want to get to a place where you don't have acceptance criteria, you just have small stories. Now there's a point of diminishing returns there, of course, and we'll talk more about that later. So how do we turn these into testable stories? Well, here we go. So shopper wants interface to be fun so they're happy while shopping. Well, we need some way to quantify that. It doesn't really matter what it is as long as you have some way so that when implementing, you can say, all right, so I need to find 5 internal users. All right, hey, Joe, Susan, etc. Take a look at this, try this out. And so you get 5 people internally, they try it, 3 of them say it's the best thing since sliced bread, and 2 of them run into bugs. Right, so you're not there yet, it's not fun yet. Responding quickly, how quickly? 0.5 seconds? Oh, 0.5 seconds. Wow, I was thinking I knew a way to get this from 3 seconds to 2 seconds, and that was like a 1-point story. Half a second, whew, I think that's a month worth of work for the whole team. Maybe we need to, right? So now you can have that conversation with the product owner because now we know what we're talking about. So here's 2 more. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but if you have somebody within the organization that you think is a good judge of whether or not the app is beautiful, then you just need to go to that, say, okay, this is the person we're going to use to judge, and they have a good sense of style or whatever. So you bring it to Susan and say, what do you think? And she says, hey, that's really great, except here you used a gradient and I don't think you should have, or whatever. And then on the threat assessment, right, this is actually completely rewritten to make it clearer to the user what the risk is so that they can make those decisions. But by clarifying it, now we have something that we can test, right? As an implementer, I know I just need to create a list of all missing updates by machine, and that's what's desired. I can do that. Okay. What about negotiable? This is a weird one, really, but at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're making it so that you're not locking down the exact implementation. So instead of saying something like Clothes Shopper wants to get driving directions so they can decide if they have enough time to shop, right? That's one way to do it, of course, maybe an odd way. Maybe you know, as a product owner, you're thinking, hey, they'll just use the GPS. But what you don't realize is that the app has never used GPS before, and the team doesn't have anybody that knows how to do that. You know, et cetera, et cetera. So if really the goal is to find stores near them, there are a lot of different ways to do that. So once you've met with the team and you've said, what are we going to do for this sprint, making it specific, that's fine, because now you've got the team together to decide, okay, there's the goal, how can we implement it? Now, it may be that somebody there goes, well, I just happen to know we only have 10 stores and they're all nearby. We could just show a map, right? That'd be really easy to implement, and it would be really clear to anybody, like, which store is near me. Oh, hey, that's great. Okay, well, that's a 1-point story, and it would have been, you know, a 10-point story or something like that, because we'd have to go figure out GPS and, you know, blah, blah, blah. So making stories negotiable works really well for everybody. And you don't know when you're going to get to the story. Maybe it's 6 months from now and technology has changed. You know, the capabilities of the team and the app have changed, right? So you want to try to make it something that's a goal. It's a clear goal, but it's not super specific. Now, don't feel, you know, I don't want you to feel bad if you're thinking, okay, well, we have one like this and it's pretty specific. That's fine. So when you get into planning, the other thing you can look at is say, oh, there's a way to make this more negotiable. Could we change it to this negotiable version and then discuss possibilities? Yes. Okay, good. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about splitting. Now, I haven't talked about independence yet. I want to get to that a little bit later, but we'll get there. And we want to start by talking about how do we create smaller stories. So there's a lot of different ways to split user stories, and some of them are actually pretty bad. Many of the methods that you'll find out there on the internet, if you just Google, actually take something, break it down into pieces, but they don't break it down into valuable pieces. When you break something down, the goal is that the results should also have a who, what, why, and match and vest. They should be as independent as possible, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. If they don't, then you haven't split into stories. You've probably split into tasks, things that need to be done, but by themselves are not valuable to the customer. All right, so here's an example. As a dad, I think this is pretty funny. I'm not sure why it's qualified with dad humor. I mean, it's just really awesomely funny, right? That's something that I would say. Okay, I see some eye rolling here. But anyway, so we want to do a greeting card website. That's our product. So think for a moment, if you're a tester, how would you test it? Right? What would be a good test? All right, so just think about that for a minute. Greeting card website, what would one test be to see if things are working well? All right, so let's take a look here. We've got selecting a Father's Day card, good idea. Well, let's see. So there's probably different ways to deliver this. Maybe I could get an electronic version, or I could get it FedExed if it's the day before or something like that. I'm going to select email delivery because that should work. Well, I'm testing, so I don't really want to pay for it. So I'll select the free version, and then where's it going to go? I got to put in the destination, and I got to hit the send button. And my expectation is that a Father's Day card is going to be received at the given email. So I'm going to type in something like my email address or maybe a test email address, something like that. I hit the send button. I check my email. There's nothing there. Okay, that test didn't work. So how does this have to do with creating small user stories? That's a user story, right? How is it a user story? Well, let's take a look. We can translate this to person wants to send a free Father's Day card via email to express their love, right? So that's a small slice, and it's likely something that could be implemented quickly. And actually, it could be the very first story of the whole system, right? It could be that all you have is a image of a Father's Day card. It says Happy Father's Day. It doesn't even say who it's to. There's no personalized message, right? It collects the email address, and it doesn't even say which delivery method would you like or what kind. All you have is send, and it's going to send that image to that email that was given. And you know what? If you can't get that working, why would you work on any other story? The other nice piece about this is that since it's such a small story and it's something you could implement even as the first thing with no database, no nothing, you've just got to get email working and a place to store the image and some UI, right? Once you've got that, every other piece of your system is now independent because you can build on this. You had to build this. Every other story is dependent on this. But after you have this one small story, everything else is independent. So that's one way. Split by separator. This may seem silly, but I got to tell you, I've seen a lot of stories that had commas, ands, the word not, semicolons, an ampersand, or, else, all kinds of separator words that are really just a way to put together different pieces of value. So this is an easy one. But when you're looking at a user story, look for these separators, right? So if I pull out the who, moviegoer wants to, and I pull out the why, to have fun, I have a whole bunch of what's in there. I've got find movies, find theaters, read reviews, watch previews, reserve tickets, pay for movies. Each of these things is valuable by itself. If I have an app that all I can do is I walk up to a movie theater and I say, oh, that's what's playing here and I want to see it, and I go to the app, I type in the name and I pay for it, that has value. If all I can do is reserve a ticket and all the other information I've gotten already, that has value. Previews, value, etc. So each of these can be its own individual user story. That's a pretty straightforward method. Splitting by user, persona, and market. This is something that people don't always think about, but different users have different needs. So here we have a persona, Frank. They're a business traveler who prefers American Express, and they mainly use it at restaurants. Now, there's a little bit of a story behind this that I want to tell you. I was working at a payment system company in Texas, and this is hard. This may be hard to believe, or you may think, oh, I've heard this story before. Not the exact same folks involved, but been through this, seen that movie. So they were adding American Express. They were a payment system, payment processing company. They were adding American Express, and they had 5 teams working on this for 7 iterations, 35 iterations of work. And when I started talking to them, they were towards the end of this process. And I said, hey, so, show me something. And they said, well, we can't really show you anything. And it's just the card either swipes or it doesn't. And so they weren't really working. They said they were working with Agile and they had stories, but they were really tasks. Their story per se was swipe American Express. That was it. Because it, quote, couldn't be broken down. So I worked with them and I said, well, what are some pieces of your business? And they said, oh, well, we have these different places that you can swipe a card, and we make our own, and there's the software in there, and some of these have different firmware levels, and we install a little piece into some of these. In other cases, they have different APIs, so the back end has to be written, different back end for the Ingenico, a different one for Square. And I said, you know what? Those are all stories. So, for instance, Frank paying for Amex on a Square, that by itself is a story. Or maybe, later on to do a report just to be able to see how much he spent on food, right? So that's a story. And actually a story that you might want to have when you're developing it, just so you can, test, it would still have value, is something like checking whether or not there's credit on there, right? So swiping on the Square and just checking whether or not there's credit available on the card, that has value, right? So absolutely, you can break things down by market, by persona, by user. Different users have different needs, right? So that's another thing to look at. Who is the user of the story? Think about who are all your users and personas, and is there a way to break it down so that you can meet the needs of one user, then another user, then another user as you're working towards the full product? Dependencies, right? So very often I talk to folks and they say, well, sure, we could break these stories down, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, there's all these dependencies. Okay, great. But usually the dependencies are not between, you've got a 5-point story and another 5-point story, and this 5-point story is dependent on that 5-point story. Usually it's not the whole thing that's dependent on the other story. Usually it's just a piece. So for instance, let's take a look at these two stories. Here we had 2 stories which could each be broken down into 4 1-point stories. Who knows what they're originally estimated as? 3, 5, doesn't really matter. And the story on the left had 3 pieces, all of which were dependent on 1 piece. Story on the right had 3 pieces that aren't dependent on anything, but 1 piece that's dependent on the first story. So if we can break it down, we're going to see something like this. There are 3 stories that have some pretty severe dependency, right? So the story all the way on the right is dependent on the one in the middle, which is dependent on the one on the left. But if we do that one on the left, we now have options as to what to do. We can do any of the middle ones. We can do any of the other ones on the left. We can't yet do the one on the far right until we do the middle one. But breaking things down into smaller pieces helps you to reduce dependency. It doesn't mean you're going to get rid of dependency. That's generally, impossible to get rid of all dependency. But to reduce and isolate the dependency is great. And it may turn out that nest of dependencies there, you don't need to do it right now, right? You can do some of the other stories on the left, whatever. But now, when you have the smaller stories, it gives you more options so you can make better decisions about what to do. So, got a couple more splitting examples to show you, techniques to show you. But before doing that, you may have already been thinking, you showed up to the webinar, so you're thinking small stories. That's something I want to do. But let me give you a little bit more about why we want to do this. So here I have a whole bunch of stories arranged into some kind of brick wall here. But let's say this is a sprint. This team can do 30 points. So they decided on some 1 point, some 2 points, some 3 and 5 point stories to make up the 30 points that they have. So that's an investment. Your team, your product owner, whoever's making this decision about the stories, let's just make it easy and say it's the product owner, is deciding to invest the 30 points of capacity of this team into these specific stories. What is the return? It's some business value, BV, business value. What is the business value? Well, I don't know. Let's say that you have put together a business case and it says if you do these stories, you're gonna get this return on investment. It's hoped for. Whatever it is, you can't possibly know in advance. But let's say that you found out that the business value was, whatever. We'll call that business value. Now the hope is, this is real money, right? So if you look at the team and you have 9 people on it, paying their salaries, the overhead, the benefits and all that, that is the actual cost of those 30 points. You're hoping Let's say that's, I don't know, let's just wild figure. Let's say it's $30,000. You're going to be hoping that the return that you get financially, either internal savings or profits or whatever, however you measure this business value, is worth at least that $30,000 investment. Otherwise, why are you doing it? So let's hope that it's twice as much. So you put in 30K, you're going to get out 60K, whatever. But just for a thought experiment, let's go with that. The thing is that not all of that stuff in there is what I would call gold. And if you have large user stories, that gold is locked in with silver and dirt. So let's take a look at this. If we break it down, we say, all right, we've broken it down. Let's just, for the sake of argument, we've broken it down into 30 single point stories. And we have a feeling, we don't know, but you know what? If you have a feeling that these particular stories are worth gold, those are the ones that you would want to, focus on, right? Why wouldn't you? So if you've broken it out and you think these are the gold, then these are the ones that should be at the top of the backlog. And, if you didn't break it out, you'd be doing all of this. But let's say you're breaking it out. You've also got silver, and then you've got dirt, for lack of a better word. Let's just call it dirt. So let's say you've got 10 points worth of gold, 10 points worth of silver, 10 points worth of dirt. Let me ask you this. When should you do the dirt? Yeah, never. Never. Why would you do it? There's no return on that investment. You're investing 10 story points for nothing. Why would you do that? And you could even argue, why do the silver now? Do the gold. Well, some of the gold may be dependent on some of the silver stories. That makes sense. Or, maybe you have promised somebody to do a particular story. For whatever reason, do the silver, do the gold, but why do the dirt? By removing the dirt and only doing the gold and silver stories, now you've changed your investment down to 20 points. So for 20 points, you're going to get the same return on investment. That's awesome. But you've also now got the opportunity, if you break it down this way, to add in 10 points of gold or silver or gold and silver, whatever. So by splitting into smaller stories, not only can you focus on higher value, you can also be getting that value that would have been in the next sprint or the sprint after that sooner, which means that you're reducing your opportunity cost and actually increasing the return on that investment because you can get that return earlier. So that's why you want to split. And how do you know the business value? You really don't. But if you've got smaller stories, it makes it easier to prioritize them, and the gold is going to rise to the top, the dirt is going to fall to the bottom. Right? So this gives you more information to increase the likelihood that you're getting higher value out. You won't really know until your customers tell you. But of course, you want to do everything you can to increase that possibility. All right, so the next technique here, and I believe it's actually the last technique, and then we'll get into Q&A, is something I call cake slicing. You may have also heard it as hamburger slicing, but who slices hamburgers? You just get sliders. But cake, we do slice, all right? So we're going to start out with a bad method. So we want to do greeting cards. So a bad method is to split by workflow. I need to select a card, I need to customize a card, et cetera, et cetera. So in the first iteration, I'll do select a greeting card from the card catalog, CAD from Boston, from the card catalog. Well, let me ask you this. If your users can select a whole bunch of cards, but they can't customize it, generate it, or handle a payment or send it, how much value does that have to the customer? None. So you might be thinking, well, I have to do all of these things before there's value, so what can I do? Well, we've already sort of covered this earlier with the test scenario, but this is a more generalized version of it. As technical people, we're generally really good at creating tasks. That's what we've always done. We've broken things down into tasks. So let's take advantage of that. Let's break this down into all of the tasks that would need to be done in order to produce this. All right, so we've got a whole bunch of tasks. Wow, that's a lot of tasks. And if you play this as a game, you can say, all right, how can I put these together to make a smaller user story? I'm just going to do it for you here. All right, so let's take away the original. We just have the tasks. How can we slice this cake so that we have something of value? Right there. Okay, so it's the story that we talked about earlier. By slicing through these tasks, I can put them together and implement them together as a new user story. From there, I can add on the ability to do a Valentine's Day card, right? So it's going to be an electronic one. Or I can say, you know what, we're going to only do Father's Day cards, but we're going to take payment by MasterCard. Now, if you're doing this, I would probably, suggest moving from Father's Day card to Happy Birthday card, because more people have birthdays than, well, actually, that's everybody has a dad. Anyway, there's probably more need for Happy Birthday card, probably twice as much, I would say. This is called cake slicing. All right. So let's bring it all together now. We have an original story, many ways to sort movie and theater information. This is like the worst story ever. We don't know who, there's no estimate, et cetera, et cetera. Let's improve it a little bit. Moviegoer. Oh, okay. So this isn't for the theater owner. This is not for the app vendor, whatever. This is for the moviegoer. Okay, that's a little clear. Oh, and the why is so they can find a good movie to see soon, but we still can't estimate it. So let's now make it testable. So how to sort and filter by movie, theater, et cetera, et cetera. All right, well, I can estimate it now. I got to tell you, that's a lot of work. Let's break it down a little bit. So we're going to say, you know what would be really cool here is I want to see movies that I could see in the next 2 hours. All right, so that's less work, and I can build the rest of the story on top of that, the rest of the stories on top of that. And from there, I'm going to go to, what would be really great is what are the movies that I could get to in the next 2 hours from where I am. I'm probably not going to go that far for a movie, so maybe less, but let's just go for 2 hours, coming up in the next 2 hours, that I could get to by car at least 15 minutes prior to showtime. Now, if you've ever used Fandango, they have a feature like this, but you can either find the movies that are near you that are playing, either, too far in the future, or movies far away that are coming up in the next 5 minutes. So not that useful. But if I had a list of movies that I could get to by car that are coming up, and I could get there 15 minutes before showtime, that has value. But it's still kind of a big story. What if I split it into these two stories? I want a list of movies coming up in the next 2 hours, sortable by time and or distance. I can implement that. That has some value. I get that working, tested, great, and then I add on the larger story, which is the really cool story. Then I can add on the rest of the filtering and sorting after that. But I have a basis. I can test it. I can get feedback. So that's fantastic. So taking a story that maybe not well written all the way through to the end, you can just look at it and say, all right, does it have, you can go through all the criteria. Does it have a who, what, why? Use the story splitting techniques to get it smaller, make it clearer, etc. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. We're going to do Q&A in a moment. If you like this, we have a more in-depth user story workshop coming up on April 24th in Woburn, Mass, if you're a local. It's 4 hours. It includes lunch. It's just $95 a person. And you can bring your own user stories with you, and we'll work together to improve them within the workshop. Not just me, but with your fellow participants. So, don't bring anything that's a trade secret, but feel free to bring stories. And we'll send you more details in a follow-up. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. And if you haven't already asked a question, feel free to ask one now. So what have we got for questions?
Hey, Damon, there's a couple of questions. So one of them is, how can we know the value of a user story, or what the value is of a user story?
Well, there's no surefire way to figure out the value there. You won't really know until, after you've got it out there. But you can definitely take a guess. You can do surveys, whatever. But what you can do is, by breaking stories down into smaller pieces, you can determine which has higher or lower value. And so, of course, you want to focus on the high value. So whatever the value is going to be, which you won't know till later, you'll know that you've maximized the possible value. Now, different ways to determine the value of a story, even relatively, there's all kinds of ways to do that. That's kind of beyond the scope here. But surveying customers, that's really the thing to do. And you can have users say, hey, I can't tell you how much value this is, but I can tell you that this story has more value than that one. And if you talk to enough users, you're going to get a good sense. There's actually a product I recommend out there called, oh my God, what's it called? Oh, User Voice, which helps you do that online with large groups of people. I've used it many times before. Really love it. I don't think User Voice is the only one out there, but that's the one that I used most recently.
Great, thanks. Another question just came in as well. There's usually a fair amount of research associated with our stories. Can we manage that using these stories or splitting approaches?
Sure. So research, there's a sort of a great way just to get to a question underneath here, I think. Research stories are fine, right? So if you don't know what the outcome is, that's fine. That's sort of an internal thing, but it's much better to split apart the research from the actual implementation. So take all the research, put it in its own story, and rather than story pointing it, give it a time box, right? And because it's investing. So say to the product owner, how much do you want to invest in this research? So they might say, oh, an hour, or wow, this is really important. This is foundational. We need to do this. Let's do a week. Let's do 2 days or whatever. And then, of course, you can break that research down into, maybe you're comparing different products. So you could say, or different libraries that you might use or something like that. So say, all right, first step, let's just go figure out what are the top 3 that are out there. And, maybe we'll just, pick from that. And then let's give that, 1 day. And then next, based on that, you might say, all right, another story is that I want to research which of these is better in our environment, whatever. But you want to think of it as an investment and have the product owner decide how much do they want to invest. So if you invest the day and you come back and you're like, wow, this is incredible. We could spend a month trying to make this decision. The product owner might say, you know what? So-and-so said that we could probably build this ourselves in 2 weeks. So rather than invest all this time in research, let's go ahead and build it ourselves, right? So I think that's one way to look at it.
Great, thank you. Another question. In your story, you implied you created a database of movies from multiple sources with ability to sort all in one sprint.
Okay. So coming up with the contents for what to sort is certainly one piece of it, but you could have a database with 1 or 2 movies in it, and the sorting, however much you need to do the testing. You could have a test database with, 10 movies in it, and you can determine whether, sorting is working or not. Just get the sorting working. But the other possibility is that you already have an app that's, got the movies in there, and you just haven't done sorting yet. You put it out in some single way. You don't have any user selectable way to sort. So you're adding them on, and the database is already there. I'm not sure if that answered the question. Anybody feel free to ask a follow-on if I didn't fully answer something.
Great.
And of course, if there's a lot of ways to sort, you would and you're feeling like you can't fit it in one sprint, just pick one of the ways to sort. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks, Damon. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Okay, great.
Great. When splitting stories, how small is too small? And a second part to that question, how many stories should a typical team have in every sprint?
Okay, sure. Well, you know, if it takes an hour to split a story and you have a sense that implementing it would take an hour, then that's basically too small. I think it's sort of a calibration thing, and that's where your retrospective comes in. If you find you're spending too much time splitting stories, and in the retrospective, you know, somebody says, "Hey, we're spending too much time splitting stories," that might be a good indication that you're going too far. Now, on the other hand, what I find is that the more effort you put into learning how to and practicing actually splitting user stories, the better you get at it. Everybody gets good at it, including, you know, the product owner. Hopefully the product owner more than anybody. So as you write stories, I think you'll be in a habit of making them small. So for myself, I find that when I'm coding, I will actually get some stories done that have value that somebody could use start to finish within hours, you know, all the way from, ooh, I had a new idea to, you know, putting the UI together, coding it, back end, testing, you know, writing the test, testing it, can be done within an hour. So I don't think there's a too small there, and it really depends on the team, and that's something that you'll calibrate what makes sense for your team. As for how many, I talked to a team recently that had, you know, a decent sized team. I think it was like, you know, 10 people, maybe a little large, but anyway, about 10 people, and they had 2 stories for the whole sprint, and they were like 40-point stories, and I was a little shocked, but that's too few. So I would say each individual on the team, yeah, well, let's just make it simple. If you you know, if we look at the number of developers, each developer on the team should have at least 3 or 4 stories to do throughout the course of the sprint. So if you had, say, 4 developers on your team, that's going to be somewhere between, you know, 16 to 20 stories. And hey, the more the merrier. And if you're thinking about your story as being pretty lightweight, you know, maybe a headline and a few more details, then it's not going to take a lot of time to generate those stories.
Okay, great. Thanks, Damon.
Hey, well, my pleasure. I had a great time. I hope everybody else gets something out of it as well.
Yeah, so I think this is a good stopping point. We don't want to go overtime on everybody. We will, like as Damon said, we will definitely send out a follow-up email. We have a recording of the webinar that we can send. If you guys have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to Damon, or you can reach out to myself. This is Brian Green of Banner Solutions. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest.